Dawn did not arrive gently that morning. It crept over the horizon like a reluctant witness, revealing a battlefield already heavy with fear. The men stood in silence, gripping weapons that suddenly felt too light, too fragile. Across the plain, the enemy stretched endlessly, banners rippling, armor glinting, numbers so vast they blurred into a single moving wall. 10 soldiers for every one of theirs. No reinforcement, no miracle promised. Only the certainty that most of them would not see another sunrise. They had known the odds long before this moment, but numbers feel different when they are breathing in front of you, when the ground trembles beneath thousands of marching feet, when the air carries the sound of drums meant to crush morale before the first blow is ever struck. Some men whispered prayers. Others stared ahead, empty-eyed, already rehearsing their deaths.
Fear moved through the ranks like a living thing, tightening throats, slowing breath, daring anyone to break formation and run. This was not the kind of army songs were written about. They wore mismatched armor, carried worn blades, and bore the scars of past defeats. They were farmers, laborers, conscripts pulled from homes that would forget them just as quickly. No poets waited to record their names. No monuments were planned in their honor. History, it seemed, had already decided their fate. Across from them stood power in its purest form, a force backed by wealth, discipline, and generations of victory, an army that conquered not just land, but memory itself. Every previous enemy had fallen, been absorbed, erased. To face them was to stand against the inevitable march of history, and inevitability does not negotiate. As the moments stretched, doubt grew heavier than armor. Some wondered why they were even here.
Others questioned the orders that had led them into this open field, with no walls to hide behind, no hills to defend. Logic offered only one outcome. Reason whispered that survival meant surrender, or escape, or obedience to fear. Yet still, no one moved, because beneath the terror, something stubborn remained, a quiet refusal to disappear without being seen. If this was the day they would be crushed, then it would not be in silence, not without forcing the world, even briefly, to notice that they had stood here. In that suspended heartbeat, destiny hesitated, as if uncertain whether to crush them completely or allow defiance one final breath alive. The enemy horns sounded, low and thunderous, rolling across the field like a final warning. Lines began to advance. Dust rose. The moment had arrived. In every mind was the same unspoken thought: this is where it ends. History agrees with that instinct. By every rule of war, they should have been annihilated within hours.
Their defeat was not just likely, it was expected. And yet, something happened on that field that defied calculation. Because this was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of one history would later struggle to explain. They were not born in army. They did not march from marble cities or train beneath golden banners. This force was assembled from the edges of society, drawn together by necessity rather than glory. Farmers who left fields unharvested, shepherds who traded staffs for spears, veterans of forgotten wars whose names already faded from memory. They came from villages too small to appear on maps, places history rarely bothers to remember. What bound them was not loyalty to an empire, but survival. They fought because the alternative was erasure. Behind them were homes, families, and identities that would vanish if the enemy advanced one step further. This was not conquest. It was defense in its rawest form.
And yet, when history recorded the age they lived in, their presence barely registered. Chronicles overflowed with the names of kings, generals, and conquerors, but this army existed only as a footnote, if at all. When empires write history, they favor clean narratives. Victors are celebrated. Losers are simplified. Complications are quietly removed. This army was inconvenient. They did not fit the image of heroic triumph or noble defeat. They were ordinary people who disrupted an outcome that should have been predictable. Their survival challenged the myth of invincibility that powerful states depended on. So their story was reduced, fragmented, and eventually forgotten. Over time, records changed, numbers were adjusted, credit was reassigned. What had once been a collective act of resistance was reframed as a minor skirmish, or absorbed into the legend of someone more acceptable to remember. Monuments were raised elsewhere, songs were written about others. Silence did the rest.
This is how history erases without destroying. It does not deny that something happened, it simply stops talking about it. But absence leaves traces, in mismatched accounts, in unexplained delays in enemy campaigns, in victories that seem too easy, or defeats that make no sense. When historians look closely, they find gaps where this army should be, shadows where substance once stood. They were not forgotten because they failed. They were forgotten because they succeeded without permission. Their existence proved that power was not absolute, that numbers alone did not guarantee control, and that truth was dangerous. If this army truly mattered so little, history would not have worked so hard to bury them. And to understand why they vanished from memory, we must first understand the world that tried to erase them. That world was shaped by empires, borders, and ambitions far larger than any single soldier.
To see why this army was dismissed, minimized, and overwritten, we must widen the lens. The battlefield was only one piece of a much greater struggle, one defined by power, fear, and control. Before steel ever met flesh, forces beyond the field had already decided whose stories would endure and whose would be allowed to fade. It is here, in this wider world, that the true scale of what they faced finally becomes clear, and the odds grow even more terrifying than imagined. They were standing against a world designed to crush them. The empire they faced was not merely a rival state, but a system perfected for domination. Its borders stretched across continents, binding cities, roads, and resources into a single machine of control. Armies were not raised in desperation, but manufactured through doctrine, discipline, and endless supply. War was not a risk for this empire, it was a routine. Its soldiers were trained from youth, hardened by constant campaigns, rewarded with land and status.
Logistics followed them like a shadow. Where they marched, food arrived. Where they camped, fortifications rose. Intelligence networks fed commanders information weeks in advance. Every engagement was calculated, rehearsed, refined. Victory was not hoped for, it was expected. Culturally, the empire believed in its own inevitability. Conquest was framed as order, resistance was labeled chaos. Those who opposed expansion were not enemies, but obstacles delaying progress. This belief made the empire dangerous because it removed doubt. Doubt slows armies, certainty drives them forward without mercy. Against this stood a force with no empire behind it, no vast treasury, no standing bureaucracy to replace losses or absorb failure. Their lands were fragmented, their politics divided, their resources stretched thin even before the war began. On maps drawn by imperial scholars, they barely existed, reduced to border regions or empty space. On paper, the comparison was absurd.
One side possessed overwhelming numbers, superior weapons, professional command, and decades of momentum. The other had familiarity with the land, a reason to fight, and little else. Military theorists would later say resistance was irrational, that surrender would have been logical, that annihilation was inevitable. And this is what made the moment so terrifying, because everyone knew how this story was supposed to end. Empires do not lose to smaller forces, not in open confrontation, not without internal collapse or betrayal. History provided endless examples reinforcing the same lesson. Resistance delays defeat, it does not prevent it. Every advantage belonged to the enemy. They chose the time, they chose the ground. They controlled the narrative even before the first clash. To oppose them was to step into a current that had already swept countless others away. Yet something about this world, so carefully ordered, hid a flaw. Empires rely on predictability.
On the assumption that fear will behave as expected, that weaker forces will act rationally, that numbers alone dictate outcomes. The forgotten army existed outside those assumptions, and in a world built for domination, unpredictability was the one element power could never fully control. To understand how that weakness would be exposed, we must look closer, beyond empires and maps, beyond doctrine and numbers. There was a moment when cold calculation met human decision. The true story begins not with the empire's strength, but with the impossible imbalance that forced a smaller force to choose how it would face extinction. That choice, made under crushing pressure, would soon redefine what victory and survival truly meant for history and for generations afterward. The numbers alone were enough to end the conversation. For every soldier standing in the forgotten army's ranks, 10 waited across the field. 10 blades, 10 shields, 10 chances to strike where one could not.
No general trained in logic or reason would call this a battle. It was a calculation, and the result was already known. Manpower was only the beginning. The enemy's forces were organized into layered formations, designed to rotate fresh troops while exhausted ones fell back. Losses were expected and easily replaced. Commanders could afford mistakes. The forgotten army could not. Every fallen soldier was a wound that could not be healed. Weapons told the same story. The Empire soldiers carried standardized arms, forged for durability and mass production. Their armor was uniform, tested, reliable. In contrast, the smaller force bore whatever they could find or inherit. Blades sharpened too many times, shields repaired with mismatched wood, armor passed down, dented and ill-fitting. Courage does not stop steel, and everyone knew it. Then there was the land itself. The battlefield offered no mercy, no narrow passes to funnel the enemy, no walls to shelter behind.
The terrain was open, exposed, perfect for overwhelming numbers to surround, encircle, and crush resistance from every side. Any retreat would collapse into chaos. Any advance would be swallowed by sheer mass. Supply lines deepened the imbalance. The Empire's camps overflowed with food, water, and equipment. Their soldiers would eat regardless of outcome. The forgotten army had rationed for days, unsure if tomorrow would ever come. Hunger gnaws at morale long before swords meet. Logic spoke clearly, too clearly. Every factor aligned against them. Training, numbers, equipment, terrain, logistics. Strip the moment of emotion and belief, and there was nothing left to justify hope. No reinforcement was coming. No hidden ally waited beyond the horizon. No secret weapon rested in reserve. This is why no strategist would bet on them. War, at its core, is probability, and probability had already chosen a side.
Yet standing there, surrounded by certainty of defeat, something stubborn resisted calculation. Faith is not always religious. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to accept the conclusion logic demands, a belief that survival does not always follow the rules written by those in power. The men knew the numbers. They felt the weight of every disadvantage. But they also understood something else. Retreat would not save them. Surrender would not spare their homes. If logic offered only extinction, then logic alone was no longer worth obeying. In that realization, hopelessness deepened, but it also sharpened. When there is nothing left to lose, fear changes shape. It stops asking how to survive and starts asking how to matter. And it was in that narrow space between reason and resolve that a decision began to form, a decision born not from advantage, but from desperation, the kind of choice only made when all outcomes appear equally fatal.
Because if victory was impossible, then the only thing left to decide was how impossibility would be faced. He was not the man anyone expected to be standing there. When his name passed through the ranks, it did not inspire confidence. It inspired questions. Some remembered his earlier campaigns, the ones that ended quietly, without glory. Others recalled decisions that had nearly cost lives, choices that seemed reckless or naive. He was not born into command, nor shaped by elite academies. Power had not selected him. Circumstance had.
Among the officers, doubt lingered openly. Whispers spread that someone else should be leading, someone safer, someone proven. Even the soldiers sensed it. They watched him from a distance, searching his face for certainty, for some sign that he knew something they did not. What they saw instead was a man burdened by awareness. He understood the odds better than anyone.
He had studied them, measured them, replayed them in his mind until sleep became impossible. He knew history would never forgive failure, and he knew success, if it came at all, would not be credited to him. This leader had learned early that authority does not guarantee loyalty. It must be earned in moments when fear overwhelms discipline. He had made mistakes before, trusted the wrong advisors, hesitated when speed mattered. Those failures followed him now, clinging tighter than any armor. The army did not need a symbol. It needed an answer. Inside the camp, tension thickened. Some urged caution, suggesting delay, negotiation, retreat. Others demanded action, any action, before morale collapsed completely. Every option sounded like surrender, dressed in different language. The leader listened without interruption, absorbing doubt from every direction. Silence became his shield. What separated him was not confidence, but clarity. He saw what others refused to accept.
That fighting by the enemy's rules guaranteed destruction, that copying imperial tactics was suicide, that survival required abandoning expectations entirely. Conviction did not arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, as certainty often does when there is no one left to agree with you. He understood that his next decision would either destroy what little trust remained or redefine it forever. When he finally spoke, it was not with speeches or promises. They were no appeals to glory, no illusions of easy victory. He did not deny the fear. He acknowledged it. And then he asked a question that unsettled everyone listening. What if defeat was only inevitable because they were behaving exactly as expected? The idea spread uneasily. Soldiers exchanged looks. Officers stiffened. This was not how wars were won. This was not how armies survived. It was dangerous to challenge certainty, especially when certainty belonged to an empire. Yet something shifted.
Doubt did not vanish, but it began to change shape. It turned inward, toward assumptions that had gone unchallenged. The leader did not ask them to believe in him. He asked them to consider the possibility that the enemy's confidence was its greatest weakness. What he decided next would demand absolute trust, not in strength, but in unpredictability. And even before the order was given, some men sensed it. Whatever was coming would shock them first, long before it ever surprised the enemy. The decision was not written down. No formal orders were issued that morning. What was about to happen could not survive ink or record. It lived only in voices, in eye contact, in the shared understanding that once it began, there would be no undoing it. The leader chose not to defend. He chose not to retreat. He chose to advance in a way no doctrine would approve. Instead of tightening their lines, they would loosen them. Instead of preserving strength, they would spend it immediately.
Instead of protecting their center, they would expose it. To any trained commander, the plan sounded indistinguishable from madness. It violated every principle designed to keep armies alive. But that was precisely the point. The Empire expected fear to behave predictably. They expected the smaller force to brace, to absorb pressure, to collapse inward as numbers overwhelmed them. They expected resistance to slow, then shatter. What they did not expect was sacrifice used as a weapon. This plan required men to walk directly into danger, with full awareness that many would not return. Not as a last stand, but as a deliberate opening move. Units were reassigned not by strength, but by resolve. The strongest were not placed where survival was likely, but where loss would be unavoidable. There would be no reserves, no fallback positions, no second attempt. As the order passed through the ranks, silence replaced fear. This was no longer about winning safely. Safety had been removed from the equation entirely. The men understood what was being asked of them. They were being told that survival depended on giving the enemy exactly what they would never expect to be given willingly: sacrifice.
Some hesitated, others nodded without speaking. A few turned away, steadying their breath. This was not courage born of hope, it was clarity born of acceptance. When retreat leads to extinction, standing still becomes pointless. The leader walked among them, not to inspire, but to confirm. Eyes met. No speeches were needed. The decision had already been made collectively the moment logic failed them. All that remained was execution. The risk was absolute. Timing had to be flawless. Movements had to look chaotic while being perfectly intentional. One unit breaking early could unravel everything. One misread signal could expose the truth too soon.
Against an enemy that punished mistakes without mercy, perfection was the only margin left. And yet within that danger lay the first real advantage they had possessed all along. The Empire believed itself untouchable. It had never needed to imagine an opponent willing to abandon survival instincts entirely. It had never planned for an enemy that treated loss as leverage. As the formation shifted, the enemy commanders watched with confusion. What they saw did not match expectation. Lines thinned where they should have strengthened. Gaps appeared where defenses should have closed. They assumed panic. They assumed desperation. They assumed victory was already unfolding. That assumption would cost them dearly, because once the signal was given, there would be no retreat, only forward motion, only commitment, only the irreversible collision between safety preserved and sacrifice chosen. And in that choice, everything was about to change. The first impact shattered the illusion of order.
Sound exploded across the field as metal struck metal, shields splintered, and men collided with a force that erased thought. The ground churned beneath stamping feet, turning dust into a suffocating cloud that swallowed banners and blurred lines. Commands were shouted, lost, shouted again. Control dissolved into instinct. At first, the Empire surged forward exactly as planned. Their numbers pressed inward, surrounding exposed gaps, cutting down the first ranks with brutal efficiency. Bodies fell quickly, too quickly. To any observer, it looked like collapse had begun. The smaller force appeared to be breaking apart under the weight of inevitability. But then, something strange happened. Instead of retreating, the exposed units pushed deeper. They did not close ranks, they widened them. They advanced into the crush, pulling enemy soldiers with them, drawing formations forward, stretching lines thin where they were meant to be dense. What should have been chaos began to move with purpose.
The Empire's commanders shouted for adjustments, for reinforcements to plug gaps that should not have existed. Orders overlapped. Units hesitated, uncertain whether to pursue or regroup. In war, hesitation is a crack, and cracks spread fast. The forgotten army moved like water poured into stone channels. Individual fights were brutal and short, but collectively they shaped the flow of the battlefield. Small groups vanished beneath waves of enemies, exactly as planned, and in doing so created empty spaces behind them, spaces the Empire had never intended to leave unguarded. Confusion replaced confidence. The noise of battle grew uneven. Drums fell out of rhythm. Signals contradicted each other. What had begun as controlled dominance became fragmented violence. Soldiers accustomed to command-driven warfare found themselves isolated, fighting without clear direction. Then momentum shifted. From the Empire's rear, pressure mounted unexpectedly.
Units sent forward too aggressively found themselves cut off, surrounded not by numbers, but by intent. The terrain, once an open advantage, now magnified disarray. Dust hid movements. Sound distorted distance. The enemy could no longer see the battlefield as a whole. The forgotten army paid dearly. Losses were immense. But every sacrifice brought confusion, and confusion became leverage. Fear began to change sides. The Empire had never learned how to fight an enemy that refused to behave logically. They had never faced opponents who used chaos as structure. Men who had expected an easy victory now struggled to understand what was happening. The certainty that had carried them into battle began to fracture. When certainty breaks, control follows. Somewhere, Amid the noise, the realization spread quietly, then all at once. This was not collapse. This was something else. The impossible was happening. As the battle raged toward its breaking point, no one could yet see the outcome clearly.
Victory was not secure. Defeat still hovered close, but the balance had shifted just enough to make one truth undeniable. History was no longer following the script it was supposed to. Silence returned before celebration ever could. The field was littered with the cost of survival. Bodies unmoving, weapons discarded, banners torn into the dirt. The enemy had pulled back, not in triumph but confusion. Against every expectation, the forgotten army still stood, breathing, wounded, alive, for now at least together. They looked for victory and did not find it easily. No cheers rose, no horns sounded. Men searched the ground for friends, for brothers, for proof that the sacrifice had meaning. Survival came wrapped in grief, because everyone knew how much had been given away to earn it this day. By the narrowest measure, they had won. The enemy withdrew, plans broken, confidence shattered. But victory did not feel clean or complete. Too many voices were missing.
Too many spaces in the ranks would never be filled again, and the silence of those gaps carried weight far beyond counting today. The battle marked a shift larger than territory gained or lost. It cracked the myth of inevitability surrounding the empire. For the first time, its advance had been halted, not by equal force, but by refusal. Others would hear of this and begin to question what power truly meant now. Yet the cost could not be hidden. Entire units had vanished. Decisions made in minutes echoed through generations of families who would never know why their sons did not return. Victory demanded remembrance, and remembrance demanded honesty, something history rarely grants the defeated or the inconvenient when empires control memory. The forgotten army understood this before anyone else. They did not celebrate loudly because they sensed what was coming. Survival had changed them. They were no longer invisible villagers or expendable fighters.
They had become a problem history would struggle to explain without admitting that power could be broken apart. Victory did not end the war, it reshaped it. Alliances shifted quietly. Enemy commanders rewrote reports. What could not be denied on the field would later be softened on the page. The truth was dangerous, and dangerous truths rarely survive untouched when politics demands obedience over accuracy and comfort always. For those who survived, nothing returned to normal. They carried the memory of chaos and control intertwining, of sacrifice forcing change. They had stood where logic ended and consequence began. Whatever history decided to call it, they knew what it cost in blood, absence, and lives forever divided from peace. This moment became a hinge of history. Before it, resistance seemed futile. After it, certainty weakened. The empire would continue, but doubt had entered its bloodstream.
And doubt, once introduced, spreads quietly, patiently, until even giants begin to stumble under the weight of questions they were never meant to face. What happened next would determine whether this victory endured or vanished from memory. Battles can be won in a day. Stories are lost over centuries. And the forces that shape memory were already moving, deciding how much of this truth the world would be allowed to remember long after today. The erasure did not happen all at once. It never does. It began quietly, with wording. Reports described delays instead of defeats. Engagements were renamed, reframed as strategic withdrawals or minor setbacks. The battle was mentioned, but the force that had made it possible was reduced to a vague reference, an unnamed obstacle brushed aside in a larger narrative of progress. Empires do not deny failure directly, they dilute it. Official records emphasized weather, terrain, miscommunication, anything but resistance.
Anything but the idea that a smaller, disposable force had forced power to hesitate. Credit was shifted upward, reassigned to commanders who were not present, or absorbed into the legend of the empire's own resilience. What could not be removed was repurposed. Historians followed the trail they were allowed to see. They relied on preserved documents, sanctioned accounts, archives filtered through generations of authority. Over time, repetition hardened distortion into fact. What was written most often became what was believed. Silence filled the rest. The forgotten army suffered a second defeat here, not on the battlefield, but on the page. Their names were excluded, their numbers adjusted downward, their role reframed as incidental. In some accounts, they disappeared entirely, replaced by abstractions like unrest, disorder, or local resistance that was swiftly corrected. This was not accidental. Their story challenged the foundation of imperial legitimacy.
If the empire could be stopped, even briefly, then its claim of inevitability was false. And if that was false, then obedience was no longer guaranteed. So memory was managed. Monuments rose elsewhere. Victories were celebrated loudly, repeatedly, until they drowned out quieter truths. Generations passed, and absence became normal. People cannot miss what they are never told existed. The forgotten army became exactly that. Forgotten not because they failed, but because they succeeded without permission. Yet erasure is never perfect. Fragments survived, conflicting accounts, gaps in timelines, sudden pauses in expansion that official explanations could not fully justify. These inconsistencies lingered like cracks beneath polished stone. Those who looked closely noticed them. They asked why an unstoppable force had stopped, why records skipped days, weeks, entire campaigns, why victory required so much explanation. The answer was uncomfortable.
You were never meant to hear this story, because it does not flatter power. It does not praise order or hierarchy or destiny. It reminds us that history is not just what happened, but what was allowed to be remembered. And once that realization settles in, something else becomes impossible to ignore. If this story was buried so carefully, then its meaning must extend beyond the past. Because truths that threaten power rarely disappear forever. They wait. And when they resurface, they force us to ask not just what happened back then, but what stories today are being shaped, softened, or silenced for the same reasons. Their story survives because it refuses to stay buried. Long after empires fade and borders change, the same patterns repeat. Power still presents itself as inevitable. Numbers, wealth, and authority still claim ownership over outcomes before they unfold. And smaller voices are still told that resistance is irrational, that acceptance is wisdom, that history has already decided. But history is not a force of nature. It is shaped by human choice. The forgotten army matters because they reveal the space where choice exists, even when outcomes appear fixed. They were not stronger. They were not better equipped. They did not possess secret advantages waiting to be discovered. What they had was the willingness to act when logic offered only submission. That willingness still unsettles power today. Every generation produces its own empires, not always nations, but systems, institutions that declare themselves permanent, narratives that insist alternatives are impossible. People are still told that certain struggles cannot be won, that resistance only delays the inevitable. The lesson of this army is not that victory is guaranteed, it is that inevitability is often a story told by those who benefit from it.
Their legacy lives wherever underdogs refuse to disappear quietly, wherever belief persists without permission, wherever sacrifice is chosen not for glory but for meaning. The battlefield may change, but the tension remains the same. Hope versus calculation, faith versus probability, humanity versus systems designed to erase it. This is why their story feels dangerous even now. It reminds us that control depends on compliance, that narratives survive because they go unchallenged, and that once people stop behaving as expected, even the most powerful structures begin to fracture. The forgotten army did not set out to inspire centuries later. They did not know their stand would echo beyond their own survival. They only knew that if they were to be erased, it would not be without consequence. That decision still ripples outward, quietly asking the same question of us. What do we accept as inevitable today, simply because we are told to?
History belongs to those who write it, but it is changed by those who interrupt it. The powerful may dominate records, monuments, and memory, but they do not own courage, conviction, or choice. Those things emerge wherever people decide that disappearance is not an option. Their story endures because it is unfinished. It is retold every time someone refuses to accept the limits placed on them, every time logic is challenged by belief, every time power is forced to hesitate. History does not just belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who stand when standing makes no sense, and in doing so, change what the future is allowed to remember.